So the first reading that we hear from Ezekiel comes to us, and when before I get started, my grace is sufficient is a sermon title. If you look at that picture, I've got you. It's kind of not what we do on our own, but what God does with us. So Ezekiel was a priest. He's not a prophet. He didn't want to be a prophet. He knows what the prophet's going to go through. He knows that the prophet's not going to be a job that is taken easily. In priesthood, he could be a priest, work in the temple, do all the things with the other priests, and feel very confident in what he was doing. He actually did not want to become a prophet after Jeremiah. He wanted to stay in the priesthood. But God called him anyways. Son of Man, he calls him, just like Jesus is called the Son of Man. And he tells him that the nation is rebellious. And he tells him that the descendants are impudent and stubborn. And it reminds Ezekiel of the history of Israel, how they were stubborn even in the beginning. As Moses was up on the mountain and receiving the commandments, God tells Moses, the stiff-necked people that you brought out of Egypt. And Moses reminds him, I didn't bring them out of Egypt, you did. But even then they were stubborn and stiff-necked. Stubbornness is not a trait that we want. It's okay to be stubborn in some things, I guess, but it's not a trait that respects the idea or the change that might happen within us. Stubbornness is not what we need in our church or what we need from people in the church. Stubbornness doesn't bring anything except heartache, because that means you're not open to dialogue, you're not open to listening to other people. It happens today as we listen to people talk. Some people, once the conversation starts, will tune you out because it's not their talking points, it's what you believe is right. So Paul goes into the same situation. I didn't look it up on the psychologist's website, but I believe, I believe that most people want to be liked. I believe it's a natural trait for all of us. Most of us want to be liked. Most of us want to be appreciated or have someone say something like, that was really good, I like what you did there, or we're so happy that you came to visit. To have that appreciation. Most people like to be liked. Paul is no different from anybody else, but he's working for the Lord. And what does Jesus tell his disciples? People will hate you because of my name. Well, people didn't just dislike Paul. They really did hate him because he was a good evangelist. Even his own brothers and sisters that were apostles were upset because Paul was getting all this recognition. And believe me, the people of Corinth were being pulled in two different directions. The second letter to the people of Corinth, Paul addresses the church as well as the people in Corinth that they witnessed his ministry and evangelism. Paul's enemies had accused him of using ministry for personal gain. Personal gain. But he proved his ministry was sincere by showing them all the different things that he gave up to be a minister. Ezekiel's going to give up a lot of things to be a prophet for Israel. He's going to give up the ability to have, I would say, stability in his life. To know that he's going to be taken care of with all the other priests because there'll be food given to him. There'll be water supplied. Everything is supplied for the priest. But as a prophet, you're on your own. You're making your own way. You're doing it all yourself. God is with you, but he's weak. Not weak in mind or body, but weak in faith that he's going to be a good prophet. Paul has weaknesses as well. Paul has a lot of weaknesses. And so do you. And so do I. As Paul goes through this time of trial, he reminds and challenges the hearts of the Corinthians and assures them that he loves them. Paul reminded them of their trials, of the trials that he took. They became followers of Jesus and they went through trials too. He pointed out that the false preachers have done nothing in the community. They're doing nothing. They have not done anything in or for the church except invade the church. They came in and they tried to change the mindset of the people that were following Christ already. Sounds very familiar in the church today. If you don't agree with us in the way we're going with the Bible, then leave. I have a friend of mine in Ohio that was told by the pastor because he disagreed with how they were going to do things in the church. He's been one of the founding members of the congregation, a man of good integrity, a man of purpose. And the pastor said, well, you disagree with my thoughts, so you need to leave the church. We can have a disagreement of thought. And I'm not going to ask you to leave the church. But people were coming at Paul for his short-sightedness, his use of the church for his own personal gain. Now, there are pastors out there that will use the church for their own personal gain. But that isn't Paul. That isn't how Paul was functioning. Paul addresses and the people gathering and speaks to them about the call of bringing the good news of Jesus Christ to Corinth. It was Paul who fulfilled the work of the ambassador as described in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 18 through 19. Even as he spoke now, Paul was not certain that everybody in the church who professed that they be saved was truly going to be a child of God. He quoted Isaiah chapter 9, verse 8 in this as he appealed for them to receive God's grace. And it deals with the reconciliation of Christ on the cross. Because of that reconciliational work that Christ did, Paul tells them again, the day of salvation is upon you. He is trying to get those gathered to hear that there is no guarantee that any sinner will be or have the opportunity to be saved tomorrow. No one will have that opportunity except for today. You can either be saved today or tomorrow may not happen for you. Now, as I was reading for this sermon, I was reading one of the commentaries. There was a really good story about a pastor and a member of the congregation. Doesn't matter if it's a female or a male. They were talking about salvation. And he said to the person, he said, well, how about if we do a baptism, and or you don't want to be baptized because you were already baptized, but let's sign a paper together saying you believe in Jesus and that Jesus is your Savior. I'm not ready to do that today, the person said. He goes, okay, when will you be ready? How about a year from now? The pastor's trying to get her to do that. And so he says to him, he goes, how about next month? Would you sign it next month? No, I'm not ready to do that. Well, let's do it then earlier. How about if we do it in 2 weeks? I don't want to do that. Well, let's go back to today. Will you sign it today? I'm not ready to do that. Well, if the person died today and couldn't make that commitment to Christ, they're no longer saved. If you don't believe in Jesus as your Savior, if you don't believe that Jesus died for you, then you can't be saved. We've talked about that many, many times. And this is what Paul was trying to tell them. We don't have to worry about what tomorrow is because our faith today, God's grace for us, is sufficient. He's got us. He's got you. And that brings me to my sermon title, My Grace is Sufficient. So let me read 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 9. To keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. My grace is sufficient. So Paul has shortcomings. When Moses was trying to negotiate with God about going to Egypt to free the captives, the Israelites, from the Egyptian ruler, Moses said to him, I'm not good at speaking. I'm not good at speaking. In fact, I have very poor speech. In fact, Exodus 6:12 says, "But Moses said to the Lord, if the Israelites will not listen to me, why would Pharaoh listen to me, since I speak with faltering lips?" It reminds me of how God takes shortcomings and puts them to work. Oh, it was probably 2 years into the ministry here in Pensacola that a person came up to me and said to me, "Pastor, I can't always understand you when you're talking real fast." And I said, "Yeah, okay, I'll try to slow down." I do try to slow down. I think I've made great strides in 11 years, but I still talk pretty fast. "Well, you can tell you're from the north." I said, "Why is that?" "Because y'all talk fast up there." So I kindly went, "You mean you all talk slower than I do?" So I tried to slow down as best I can. Another person came up to me and said, "Pastor, I can't understand what you say in your sermons because sometimes you mumble." And I'm like, "Okay. Well, this particular day was a day where there was a lot of S's in the message." And from the time I started elementary school to 7th grade, I was in speech class because I could not pronounce an S or a Z without having problems with my pronunciation. So I looked at the person and I said, "I can't correct that. I've had years of people trying to correct it. It's just how it is. I could understand it if I was drinking and I was slurring. But I have a lisp that I cannot get rid of. And therefore, I never thought, never, in my wildest imagination, that I would be preaching and teaching in front of people. Because anytime I use the words with S's in them, I really have to concentrate on pronouncing it correctly, or it slurs up. My wife says, "You can tell when you're tired. You start to slur your words." I said, "Well, I could tell when I was drinking, too. I started slurring my words then, too, back in the Navy." But that is the truth. All of us have a weakness. That was mine. There are some things you can correct for their congregation, like slowing down. I try. And then there are some things you can't. Paul can't correct things that he's already got. And God says to him 3 times, "I'm not getting rid of it," because Paul has been praying, "Take this from me so I can do more ministry." And God is saying, "No, I'm not taking it from you because this weakness shows my strength. My grace is sufficient," God says. In other words, every time we feel weakened, every time that we feel that our enemy is able to come upon us, our enemy is about to prevail about us. And you know who our enemy is: Satan. So anytime that's happening, where people are coming against you, or Satan's coming against you, God is there for you. God is there, and we have to realize that God's strength is His grace for us. Let His grace be sufficient for you so that you have no worries of what tomorrow brings. My grace is sufficient for you, he says. God gives the glory, and God gives the defense of the glory. We don't have to try to defend ourselves or defend God's glory, because God will do it for us. The apostle had much glory and honor as he worked as an ambassador for the good news. And like every other person I've talked to, and every time I talk about going stronger and being stronger in faith and growing in faith, Satan comes upon the person and tries to derail what is there. Take away everything that person has built with God. Not for themselves, but for God. As we often talk about, we talk about a vision of our congregation. It's not our vision, it's a vision with God. We talk about the strength of our congregation. We don't talk about it being our strength, but God's strength that has given us the power to do what we're doing. The apostle had much to glory over, but he couldn't. He didn't want to be conceited. He didn't want people to think he was boasting. But then he says, I will boast in the Lord. for that is good. And there are pastors out there that carry that conceit. Paul was a minister that tried very hard not to feel conceited. You know, I can tell you that Deacon and I, people will come up to us and they'll say, oh, that was a good sermon. He talks about it all the time. Him and I talk about these things all the time. Oh, someone came up to me and said, yeah, it was a good sermon. Before I left, he says, what was that baseball player's name? Joe DiMaggio. Thank you, Pastor, for doing a Joe DiMaggio sermon and then leaving. I said, I don't believe it was a Joe DiMaggio sermon. I just think it was a long sermon. It was 24 minutes. We don't carry this ministry as a way of gaining something for ourselves. You don't carry the ministry of Christ in you as a way of gaining something for yourself. You don't. Or we would not have the congregation we have today. We would not have the giving that you have given today. If you were more worried about you, we would not have the gathering that we have. And Paul, in his ministry, has affected a lot of people. He's affected a lot of people, and people are envious of that. Satan wants to come against him because he wants to destroy what was created. The apostles are worried because Paul gets a lot of attention. And then you have this group of people that inserted themselves into his congregation that are talking lies about him and telling lies about him. That is why Paul is speaking to the people about his weakness in the thorn that is persistent while serving God. It is in that weakness, God's grace alone builds his strength. Therefore, the power of God to defend such glory is always needed. God will defend the glory for us. We've gone through a lot. You've gone through a lot personally. Some of you have gone through, I guess I'd say, the deepest pit in life. Some of you are struggling with life. Some of you are going through things that no one in this congregation would know about. But God does know about it. And you can go to God in prayer, but it doesn't mean he's going to take it away. Just like Paul went 3 times to God, please take this thorn out of my flesh. And God says, that weakness makes you stronger. So we deal with those things. I've got you. I've got you. The more you suffer, the more God sets grace, his Spirit within you, to cope with the suffering and the weakness that you have. Know God's grace is sufficient for him. Paul endures all things for the love of Christ. Knowing that, we all know that hard times have been upon us. We've dealt with our own afflictions, our own trials, our own pressures. Some have been pressed by circumstances that they can't control. Some of you, perhaps many of you, have been dealing with everyday hardships that push upon you, that causes distress, that pushes you right into the corner, and you don't know where else to go except into that corner. But I'm telling you now, go to God with it. My grace is sufficient, is what God is saying to us. Pressed into the corner because of these types of experiences, we are reminded to rely on God's grace. His grace will always be sufficient, always be a strength for us, because God is with you, not against you. Amen.